I have told this story maybe 4 times in 11 years, twice to my brother, once to a woman I was seeing who did not believe me, and once badly to a room full of people at a wedding where I got drunk and ruined a perfectly nice evening. So let me try to do it properly, just once. There was a boy standing at a gate in Knightsbridge. He was 19 years old, and when the road opened up and the sky turned the color of dirty milk and every single person on that street ran, and I mean every single one, including me, including a police officer, including a man who had spent 30 years as a firefighter and later told me he'd never run from anything in his life, that boy did not move. Not one step. I want you to hold that in your head while I tell you the rest, because it's the only part of the story I'm certain of. Everything else I have pieced together from what people said afterwards, from what I read, from what I think I saw through smoke and my own stupid panic. But that part I know, I was 50 feet away. He didn't move. My name is Danny Whitlock, and in those years I sold coffee out of a converted horse trailer on the corner of a street. I'm not going to name exactly, because there are people still living there who have had enough of strangers with cameras. Call it a road between the barracks and the park. That's close enough. Gray stone, black railings, a chemist on one side, an estate agent on the other with photographs of flats that cost more than my entire family has earned across 3 generations. I opened at 6:30, every morning. Winter, summer, the day after Christmas, the day my mother went into hospital, 6:30. That's not dedication, by the way. That's just what happens when you owe money to a man who financed your coffee trailer. The regulars came in waves. First the runners, lean, silent, headphones in, wanting espresso and no conversation. Then the dog walkers around 7, chattier, wanting to tell me about their dogs. Then the office lot from about 7:30, checking their phones with their thumbs while I steamed milk, saying thanks mate to a spot slightly to the left of my face. And then from about 8 the tourists. You could set a clock by them. They came up from the tube station in loose herds, cameras already out, following a map on a phone that never quite matched the street they were on. They were mostly lovely, genuinely. People forget that. They were excited. They'd saved up. They wanted to see the guards and the horses and the palace, and they wanted a photograph to prove they'd been. I made a lot of money off tourists and I liked them. And I'm saying that now so you understand I'm not one of these Londoners who sneers. That morning was a Thursday in late September. I remember because I'd been listening to the football on the radio the night before, and I'd slept badly, and I burned the first 3 shots of the day and had to bin them. The weather was that particular London autumn thing where the air is cold but the sun is warm, so people don't know how to dress. Half the street in coats, half in shirt sleeves. The plane trees at the top of the road had started to turn but hadn't dropped yet. There were leaves down in the gutter, a few, wet and flattened and dark. There was a smell of diesel and wet pavement, and from my trailer, coffee. That's it, that's the whole morning. I want to be clear about how ordinary it was, because if you tell a story like this, people expect there to have been a feeling in the air. A tension, something. There wasn't. It was a Thursday. The gate was about 50 feet from my trailer, on the same side of the road. Not the big famous gates, a side entrance. Black iron, a stone sentry box set into the wall and one guardsman standing in front of it in full ceremonial. The red tunic, the bearskin, the rifle held at the shoulder, the boots polished to a shine you could shave in. There was a rope barrier. There was a small brass sign asking people not to touch. Most people obeyed the sign. Some didn't. I'd been there 4 years by then and I'd seen a lot of guards. They rotated. 2 hours on, then relieved, then back again. Different faces every few days. You learn to read them a bit if you're standing on the same corner every day for 4 years. Not their personalities. They don't give you those, but small things. Some of them stood like they were carved out of the wall. Some of them had a slight lean, a settling, the weight going onto one hip and then correcting. Some of them blinked more than others. One lad had a habit of very slightly flaring his nostrils when a child screamed, which was the only thing about him that ever moved. This one I'd seen maybe 5 or 6 times over that summer. I never learned his name. Not properly. Afterwards there was a name in the papers and I've never been completely sure it was him, and I've never wanted to check, and I'd ask you to let me leave it there. I've thought about this a lot. He didn't do what he did so that a bloke with a coffee trailer could hand his name around. So in my head I call him the lad at the gate, and in this story I'll call him Trevik, which is not his name. Trevik was tall, skinny in the way boys are before they're finished, all shoulder and no chest. The tunic didn't fit him quite right across the back, and he had a face that I would describe as unfinished. You know the ones, where you can still see the boy in it, where he could have been a sixth former on his way to an exam. He had a small nick on his jaw where he'd cut himself shaving. I saw it that morning when I walked past him at 10 to 8 to buy milk from the chemist, because the delivery hadn't come. I noticed it because it was such a young thing. A shaving cut. 19 years old and standing in front of a crown property with a rifle and a scab on his chin, the size of a grain of rice. I remember thinking, someone's mum is worried about that boy. Then I bought 4 liters of milk and went back to my trailer and got on with my day. The first strange thing happened at about 20 past 9. A woman came up the road pushing a pram, and she stopped in the middle of the pavement and looked down at her feet. I only noticed because she was blocking the path and a man had to step around her, and he did that London tut, the one where you don't actually make a sound. You just exhale sharply and everybody understands. She stayed there, looking at the ground. Then she looked up and around, the way you do when you've heard a noise and you're trying to work out which direction it came from. She caught my eye. She was perhaps 30, tired-looking, hair scraped back, and she called across, quite casually. "Can you feel that?" "Feel what, love?" "The ground's buzzing." I laughed. I want to be honest about this. I laughed at her. "It's the tube," I said. "Runs right under." She nodded, satisfied, and pushed on. And I went back to grinding beans, and I put it out of my head so completely that when I tried to remember this moment 3 weeks later for a man with a clipboard, I nearly didn't. The tube does not run under that road. I knew that. I've known it for years. I just said the first easy thing that came into my mouth because it was 20 past 9 on a Thursday, and a stranger had asked me a question I didn't care about. That's the thing about disasters, I've decided. They don't arrive. They accumulate. They send small, polite messengers ahead of them, and every single one of us waves the messengers away because we're busy. The second strange thing was the smell. Around 9:30, faint, underneath the coffee, underneath the traffic. It wasn't gas exactly, not the way people describe it. It was, and I've never found a better word for this, it smelled old, like the inside of a cellar, like turned earth and rust and something chemical underneath. I sniffed and I thought, drains. Because it's always drains, isn't it? Every strange smell in London is drains. A man in a suit at my counter, waiting for a flat white, wrinkled his nose and said, "God, what is that?" And I said, "Drains, mate." And he said, "Lovely," and took his coffee and went. I don't know his name. I've often wondered whether he made it round the corner in time. There's no reason he wouldn't have. He walked off north, away from it all, coffee in hand. Statistically, he is almost certainly alive and fine, and has no idea that a man he spoke to for 11 seconds has thought about him 1,000 times. The third strange thing was Trevik. Now, I need to be careful here, because I have had 11 years to build this up and memory is a liar, and I'd rather tell you what I actually saw than what makes a better story. At about 20 to 10, I looked over at the gate, the way I did 50 times a day without thinking, the way you glance at a clock. And he had changed. That's the only way I can put it. Physically, he was exactly where he'd been, same posture, same rifle. same distance from the wall, but something in the shoulders. I've talked to a soldier about this since, a friend of a friend, older bloke, Royal Engineers, and he said something that stuck. He said there's a difference between standing still and holding still. He said you can see it if you know what you're looking for. Standing still is the absence of movement. Holding still is a decision, made over and over, several times a second. Trevik had gone from one to the other, and his eyes were moving. They weren't supposed to, not like that. They were tracking, left along the road, down, left again, to the drain cover about 10 feet in front of him, then up to the windows of the building across the street, then back down to the drain. His head didn't turn an inch, just the eyes flicking. A little girl was standing about 6 feet from him with an ice cream at 9:30 in the morning, which I remember thinking was an odd breakfast. And her father was trying to get her to stand next to the guard for a photograph, and she wouldn't do it, because she was frightened of him, the way small children sometimes are. The father was cajoling her. "Go on, sweetheart, he's not going to hurt you." And I watched Trevik's eyes go from the drain to that girl and stay there, for a full second, maybe two. Which is not nothing. When you have watched 100 guardsmen at that gate and not one of them has ever looked at anything, 2 seconds is a shout. Then his eyes went back to the drain. And I thought, and here is the thing I have never been able to forgive myself for. And I know intellectually that there is nothing to forgive, and I know that, and it doesn't help, I thought. He's just tired. And I served 3 more coffees. At 4 minutes to 10, the pigeons went up. All of them, every bird on that street at once, off the railings and off the roof of the chemist and off the pavement, a hard clatter of wings, and they didn't circle. They went up and they went south and they didn't come back. Several people looked up. There was a small laugh from somewhere. A woman said, "What's got into them?" I stood there with a jug of milk in my hand, and I watched the sky where the birds had been. And I felt it. Through my boots, through the metal floor of the trailer, a low, deep, awful hum, like standing next to a lorry idling, except there was no lorry, and it wasn't in the air, it was in the ground. It was coming up through the soles of my feet and into my knees. The milk in the jug was shivering, little rings on the surface. I put the jug down. I looked up the street and everything was completely normal. Traffic, a cyclist, an old man walking a spaniel, a group of maybe 8 tourists at the gate now, phones up, taking photographs of a 19-year-old boy in a red coat, and the boy was staring at a drain cover with his jaw set so hard I could see the muscle standing out from 50 feet away. Nobody else had noticed anything. That's the bit people don't understand. They imagine sirens. They imagine everyone screaming. For about 90 seconds it was the most ordinary morning in the world, and only 3 of us knew, me and the boy at the gate, and maybe that woman with the pram who was long gone by then, and who I hope has had a lovely life. And I did nothing. I want that in the record. I stood in my trailer with my hand on the counter, and I felt the ground humming, and I thought about all the reasons it was probably fine. Roadworks, a generator, the tube, which doesn't run there. I built a whole architecture of reasons in about 4 seconds, because the alternative was to shout, and to shout would be to make a fool of myself, and there is no fear in an Englishman deeper than that one. Trevik did not have that luxury. He couldn't shout. That was the entire point of him. He was standing at a gate under orders that go back longer than my grandmother's grandmother, and those orders say, "You do not speak, you do not react, you hold your post." So what he did was this. He moved his rifle. Small, ordinary. The kind of adjustment they make now and then, a shift of the weight, resettling the shoulder. Nothing that would make the newspapers. Except that as he did it, he brought the butt of the rifle down onto the paving stone. Once hard. Crack. The tourists jumped. One of them actually squealed and then laughed at herself. The little girl with the ice cream burst into tears. Her father picked her up and stepped back 3, 4 steps away from the gate, away from the wall, away from the drain. I have thought about that single sound more than I have thought about almost anything else in my life. Because there is a version of this story where he was simply resettling, where I have built a cathedral on top of a shrug. But he did it once at that moment, and 8 people took a step backwards, and one of them was a small girl, and 11 minutes later that patch of pavement was not there anymore. You can decide for yourself. At 2 minutes past 10, a police officer came up the road on foot. Ordinary constable. High-vis radio, the slightly bored walk of a man on a route he's walked 100 times. He stopped near the gate, not to speak to Trevik, you don't speak to them but near, and he crouched down and put his hand flat on the pavement. He'd felt it too. He stayed like that for maybe 5 seconds. Then he stood up and he took his radio off his shoulder, and he turned away slightly and spoke into it, quietly, and I couldn't hear a word. And this is the moment the street changed, not because of anything he said, because of how he stood up. Have you ever seen someone stand up from a crouch fast, properly fast? It's a very particular movement and everyone recognizes it instantly, at the level of the animal below thought. 3 separate people, all strangers to each other, stopped walking at the same time. A woman across the road put her hand on her son's shoulder. The estate agent came out of his door and stood in it, frowning. And the constable said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be casual and failing, "All right, folks, could I ask everybody to move up the road for me, please? Up towards the top, that's it, no rush." No rush. I have never in my life heard 2 words work so hard. Here is what I found out later, in the report, in the papers, in the 8 months of official language that came afterwards and explained everything and helped nobody. Under that road there was a cast-iron gas main. It had been laid in 1897. It was supposed to have been replaced in a program of works in the 1980s, and through a paperwork error that I could explain to you but which would take 20 minutes and make you very angry, it had not been. Above it, a fortnight earlier, a contractor had dug a trench for fiber optic cable and had backfilled it with the wrong material and had not compacted it properly. Groundwater had done the rest, slowly, patiently, for 14 days. The buzzing in the ground was gas moving through soil. The smell was gas and disturbed clay. The pigeons went because pigeons are not idiots. And by 6 minutes past 10 that morning, the void under that section of road held enough gas to lift 100 tons of London off its own bones. Nobody knew that at the time, not the constable, not the fire service who were 4 minutes away, certainly not me. And not Trevik. That's important, he didn't know what was under there. He just knew something was wrong, and that he could not leave. The constable started moving people up the road and they went, most of them in that reluctant British shuffle, glancing back, asking each other what was going on, laughing a bit. I came out of my trailer. I remember the cold on my arms. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should turn the gas off on my own machine, and I went back in and did that, and I have never been able to work out whether that was presence of mind or complete idiocy. By 10 past 10, there were maybe 20 of us at the top of the road, standing behind an invisible line. A fire engine had arrived and stopped 100 yards short. Men in yellow helmets were talking to the constable, and one of them was on a phone, and one of them was looking at a drawing on a tablet and shaking his head. The road between us and the gate was empty. Completely empty. Cars stopped at either end, not a person on the pavement. Except one. He was still there. Red tunic, bearskin, rifle at the shoulder, standing in front of that gate exactly the way he'd been standing at 8:30 and 9:30 and every day of the summer. 50 feet away from a hole in the world that none of us could see. Somebody said, "Why is he still there?" Somebody else said, "They'll pull him back." And a woman near me, she had an accent, Spanish or Portuguese. She was holding her phone in both hands, she said, quite softly to nobody. He is a child. The fireman with the tablet started walking down the road towards him. And I watched the whole street hold its breath. I watched a man in a yellow helmet cover 50 feet of empty pavement in what felt like a year and a half. I watched him stop in front of a 19-year-old boy and say something. And I watched the boy shake his head. Once, barely. A movement so small that if you'd blinked you'd have missed it. He shook his head and he stayed. I have spent 11 years trying to understand that. I've had people tell me it was stupid. I've had a man in a pub, a good man, a sensible man, tell me that discipline like that is a sickness, that it's what happens when you take a boy from a town with no work in it, and you break him and rebuild him into something that will stand still while the ground swallows him. Maybe. I've had others tell me it was the most magnificent thing they'd ever heard, and they'd have hung a medal on him themselves. And here's what I think, for what it's worth, from a man who sells coffee. I don't think he was being brave. Not in that moment. I don't think he was thinking about the crown or the regiment or 200 years of anything. I think he'd worked out that the gate behind him was not locked. I think he'd worked out that there were people inside those grounds. And I think he'd noticed, because he'd been watching that drain for 40 minutes and he had nothing else to do with his mind, that the fire crew were setting up at the wrong end of the road, and that if he walked away, there'd be nothing at all standing between an open gate and a street that was about to come apart. Or maybe he was just 19 and terrified, and doing the only thing anyone had ever taught him to do. I don't know, I never spoke to him. What I know is that at 14 minutes past 10, the fireman turned around and walked back up the road alone, and I could see his face as he came. And it was the face of a man who has just lost an argument he cannot believe he was having. He got to the top. He said something to the constable. The constable said, "Christ." And behind them, at the far end of that empty road, one boy in a red coat stood absolutely still, in the last quiet minute of the world. I've told you he didn't move. I said it at the start. I said it was the one thing I was certain of, the thing I'd stake my name on, that a 19-year-old boy stood at a gate in Knightsbridge and did not take one step while the rest of us ran. I need to come back to that. Not yet, but soon. Keep it somewhere at the back of your head, the way I've kept it at the back of mine for 11 years, like a stone in a shoe you've decided you can live with. The last minute was quiet. That's what nobody believes. They want engines and shouting and a countdown. What we had was 20-odd people standing at the top of a closed road in the September sunshine, not really talking, occasionally coughing, the way people do at a bus stop. A man near me was eating a sandwich. I watched him do it. He'd bought it before any of this started and he was standing there working through it, methodically, cheese and pickle, because his body was hungry and his brain hadn't yet been given permission to be frightened. Somebody's phone rang and they silenced it fast, embarrassed. The fire crew had pulled their engine back another 30 yards, and the men were standing behind it now, not in front of it. And I noticed that and understood exactly what it meant and refused to think about it. The constable had his arms out low the way you'd corral sheep. He kept saying, "Bit further back, please, bit further. Thank you, thank you." He said thank you about 40 times. The Portuguese woman with the phone in both hands was crying silently, and I have never known why. She didn't know anyone down there. She'd been on her way to a museum. Perhaps she just understood something the rest of us were still catching up to. Down at the far end, the road lay empty in the light, very clean, very still. My trailer sat where I'd left it with the hatch open and a tea towel on the counter. And in front of the gate, small at that distance, red against the gray stone, stood Trevik. 50 feet. That's what I said earlier. It was more like 180 by then because we'd all been moved. 180 feet, and he looked like a toy. At about 17 minutes past 10, the wicket gate opened. You'll know what a wicket is even if you don't know the word. It's the little door set inside the big gate, the one they use so they don't have to swing the whole thing every time someone wants to walk through. It opened inwards, a rectangle of dark appearing in the black iron, and a man stepped out onto the pavement. He was pushing a wheelbarrow. I want to be exact. He was a civilian, green overalls, Wellington boots, a wheelbarrow with a shovel and a bag of something in it, and I found out later he was a groundsman named, well, no. He's alive and he's private and he's had his own 11 years. He was 34 then. He had a daughter who was 2. He'd been working inside the grounds all morning. He'd heard nothing, seen nothing. He'd been on the wrong side of a stone wall with earphones in, spreading grit on a path. He didn't know the road had been cleared. He didn't know about the buzzing or the smell or the birds. He came out of that little door onto an empty street on a beautiful morning, and he began to push his barrow across the pavement towards the curb. Straight over the drain. Somebody at the top of the road shouted. I don't know who. It might have been me. There's a version of the memory where it's my own voice, and there's a version where it isn't. And honestly, the two have worn into each other so badly now that I've given up trying to separate them. But it wouldn't have mattered. He was 180 feet away with earphones in. The constable started to run. The fireman started to run. Neither of them was going to cover that ground. Not in time, not remotely. And Trevik moved. There. I've said it. He moved. He broke his post. He turned his head, properly turned it, the bearskin swinging, and then he came off that wall like something released. 4 paces, maybe 5. Rifle still in his hand because there was nowhere to put it and no time to think about it. And he got to the groundsman and he hit him. That's the truth. It wasn't graceful. He didn't guide him or usher him. He put his shoulder into a 34-year-old man and drove him backwards, and the wheelbarrow went over, and the shovel rang on the pavement, and the two of them went through that little door in the gate in a tangle of limbs and red wool and green overalls. I saw the groundsman's arm come up. I think he was swinging at him. I think, and he has confirmed this in a letter years later, which I'll come to, that for about 1.5 seconds a gardener in Knightsbridge believed he was being attacked without warning by a soldier of the British Army. And then the road went. I'm going to try to describe this, and I'm going to fail. There was no bang, not for me, not at first. What there was a push. The air came up the street and hit us like a wall of water, and I was on my back on the pavement without any memory of falling. The sandwich man was down. The constable, 30 yards ahead of us, was down. Every window in the estate agents went in at once, and the sound of that arrived later, long after, tinkling and absurd, like someone dropping a tray of glasses in another room. The road lifted. I mean that literally. I saw a section of tarmac perhaps 60 feet long rise as one piece, still holding its white line, still holding a manhole cover, up and up like a lid, and then break. And underneath it, this is the part I dream about, underneath it was orange. Not fire the way you've seen fire. Fire the way you'd imagine it exists under the ground, in the dark, where it has never had to be beautiful for anyone. Then the noise came and took everything. There's a hole in my memory here, not a small one, maybe 40 seconds. The next thing I have is my own hands. I was looking at my own hands and they were gray and there was blood on the left one, quite a lot, and I was trying to work out whose it was. It was mine, a window. I couldn't hear anything. That's not a figure of speech. There was a tone, very high, filling the whole world, and behind it a sort of muffled underwater roaring, and people were opening and closing their mouths near me, and I couldn't understand why they weren't making any sound. The air was full of what I thought was snow. It was paper, every scrap of paper from every desk in the 2 buildings nearest the blast. Invoices, a calendar, somebody's letter. It came down over that street for a full minute like the world's worst confetti, and it kept catching in the trees for weeks afterwards. The plane trees at the top of the road had gone bare. Not burnt, just stripped. Every leaf taken off in an instant. I remember thinking they'd turned early. Where my coffee trailer had been there was a black shape, lying on its side against a lamp post. I looked at it for a while. I couldn't get it to mean anything. Then somebody hauled me up under the arms and I was walking, and the ground was crunching in a way that ground doesn't, and I was going the wrong way towards it, not away, and whoever it was let go of me and went to help somebody else, and I kept going. I don't want any credit for that. It wasn't courage. It was a man with a head injury walking in a straight line because turning seemed complicated. Here's what the road looked like. There was a crater. It wasn't a neat bowl the way you'd imagine. It was a torn-open trench, 20 feet across at the widest, black at the bottom, with a pipe standing up out of it, split lengthwise like a peeled banana, and a low flame coming off it that would burn for another 9 hours because they could not shut it down. The pavement where the little girl with the ice cream had refused to have her photograph taken was gone. Just gone. Air and then a drop. The chemist had no front. You could see the shelves. A woman's coat still hanging on a hook. And the gate. The gate had held. Those Victorian bastards built things properly, I'll give them that. Wrought iron, 4 inches thick at the uprights, set into stone. It was bent. It was blown backwards into its own arch, and one hinge had torn out of the wall, and it hung there twisted like a page in a book. But it had held. It had taken the whole of that blast on its face, and it had stood, and everything behind it was alive. They were about 15 feet inside the gate, on gravel. The groundsman was on his front with his arms over his head. He had a cut on his scalp, and his eardrums were gone, and he was screaming and couldn't hear himself scream. And Trevik was on top of him. Not beside, on top, chest to spine, one arm hooked around the man's head, the other flung out. That's not something you do by accident when you're thrown. Ask anyone. When you're thrown, you go limp and you land like a sack. He'd got him through that door, and he'd put himself over him, in the time it takes to read that sentence twice. His bearskin was 30 feet away in a flower bed, and it was on fire. The men from the fire crew got there before I did. Of course they did. I was a concussed civilian wandering up a broken street. They were professionals who ran towards it while the paper was still falling. I stopped about 20 feet short, and I stood there stupidly, and I watched them turn him over. The tunic was open at the back, scorched. The wool had done something I didn't understand at the time. It hadn't melted, it had charred and held, and it had saved most of him. There's a reason those things are wool. There always was. His right leg was wrong. Wrong in a way that made a fireman say something quietly, and then say it again louder to somebody behind him. His face was black, uniform black, like coal dust, except for 2 clean tracks running down from his eyes where they'd streamed in the smoke. And he was conscious. He was trying to sit up. They were holding him down and he was fighting them, weakly, one arm going and his mouth was moving. I got close enough. I don't know why they let me. Nobody was in charge of anything for about 4 minutes. I got close enough to hear him, and I heard what he was saying. He was saying, "Where's my rifle?" Over and over, not loudly. He couldn't do loudly. Just that on a loop to nobody, while a man knelt on the gravel and cut his tunic open with a pair of shears. "Where's my rifle? Where's my rifle? I've got to go back on." Somebody found it. It was under him. He'd landed on it. It was underneath both of them, that whole time, and one of the firemen put it in his hand, and he stopped fighting them and lay still and let them work. I've told that to 2 soldiers. One of them laughed until he had to sit down. The other one went outside and stood in the car park for 10 minutes. They both understood it. I don't. Not really. I understand it the way I understand a language I studied at school. Nobody died. I want to say that now because I've made you wait a long time, and it isn't fair. 61 people were injured, 9 seriously. A man who ran a dry cleaner's 2 doors up lost the sight in one eye. A woman on the top deck of a bus that had stopped at the far junction has never walked properly since. But nobody died on that street, on a Thursday morning, in a road full of tourists at 10 past 10. And I want you to understand what that means. Because at 9:30 that morning there were, by the police's own reckoning, somewhere between 40 and 60 people, standing on the exact stretch of pavement that no longer exists. 40 to 60. They left because a constable crouched down and felt the ground. And he crouched down because he saw something. And what he saw, he said this, later, in a room with a lawyer in it, and it's in the transcript, and it's the only official document in the whole business that I've ever read twice. What he saw was a guardsman staring at a drain cover. He said, I looked at what he was looking at. That's it, that's the whole thing. A boy who wasn't allowed to speak looked at a drain, and a policeman noticed the direction of his eyes. The little girl with the ice cream was at the top of the road with her father when it went. She was on his shoulders. She'd stopped crying. She was fine. I know that because I saw them 9 days later. I'd gone back, everyone went back. They had to put barriers up, and I was standing at the cordon looking at what was left of my trailer, which had been dragged off to a compound somewhere and photographed and eventually scrapped, and I turned round and there they were. She was eating an ice cream, same girl, same absurd hour of the morning. Her father recognized me before I recognized him. He said, "You're the coffee man." I said I was. We stood there together for a bit and neither of us said anything about it. Then he said, "She's been asking about the soldier." And I said, "He's all right." Which was a lie, or it wasn't a lie exactly, it was the thing you say. And the girl looked up at me with ice cream on her chin and said, "Is he still standing there?" I said, "Not just now." She thought about that. Then she said, "Because he's having a rest." "That's it," I said, "he's having a rest." And her dad picked her up and carried her away, and I stood at that cordon, and I did something I'm not going to describe. And a stranger put a hand on my back, and then took it off, and went on with her day. He never went back on. That's the part that finishes people when I tell it. They want him back at the gate. They want a photograph of him in a fresh tunic with the crowd applauding. The leg was a mess. 3 operations. The hearing on the right side never came back at all, and the left came back to about half. And you cannot stand at a gate in central London and guard anything if you can't hear a footstep behind you. He was 19 when the road came apart, and 21 when they discharged him. There was a paragraph in one newspaper. It was on page 11. It got his rank wrong. There was no medal at first. There was later, years later, quietly, after a fireman with a tablet and a constable who noticed something wrote letters that they should never have had to write. I read about it in a list of names and I nearly missed it. I don't know what he does now. The groundsman wrote to me, 6 years afterwards. He'd found me through a piece I'd been stupid enough to let a magazine publish. It was 2 pages, handwritten, and it was mostly about his daughter, who was 8 by then, and about how he'd not been able to hold a job for 2 years and then had, and how he'd been to see a man about it all and it had helped. And there was one paragraph in the middle that I've read maybe 200 times. He said that when Trevik hit him, he thought he was being attacked. He said he swung at him. He said he thinks he connected, and that he has never been able to be sure, and that he'd give a very great deal to be sure. And he said that when they were on the gravel in that second before, with the boy's arm around his head, he heard him say something. He didn't hear it with his ears. He was deaf by then. He felt it in his own skull the way you feel someone's voice when their face is against yours. He wrote, I think he said sorry. They rebuilt the road. Took 14 months. New pipe, proper bedding, All of it done to a standard, all of it signed off. There was an inquiry and a report of 600 pages and a fine paid by a company that has since changed its name. Nobody went to prison. I don't think anybody should have. It was a paperwork error in 1986 and a badly filled trench in rainwater. It was nobody's malice. It was just the ordinary, patient, grinding carelessness that holds up half of everything. There's a chemist there again, different chemist. There's no plaque, I checked, there's nothing. What there is, if you know exactly where to look, is a stretch of tarmac about 60 feet long that's very slightly darker than the road either side of it, and a section of iron railing that doesn't match, because they couldn't source the original pattern. I walk past it 4 or 5 times a year. I don't work there anymore. I sell coffee out of a shop now, an actual shop in an actual building with a lease, which my brother says is the only good thing that ever came out of the whole business and which I think is probably true. I always slow down at the railings. I've never once stopped. So, I told you at the beginning that he didn't move, not one step. I said it was the only thing in the whole story I was certain of. That was a lie. Not a deliberate one. It's the shape my memory made in the weeks afterwards when I was trying to build something I could hold. The still boy, the red statue, the one fixed point while everybody ran. It's a beautiful picture and it's false, and I've caught myself telling it that way to strangers for 11 years, and every time I do it I am stealing from him. Because he did move. He stood there for 52 minutes with the ground humming under his boots, knowing something was wrong, unable to say a word about it, watching a hole in the road and hoping somebody would follow his eyes. And then, at the one moment it mattered, when there was a man with a wheelbarrow and no time at all, he came off that wall and he ran the wrong way. That's the story, not the standing. He was a 19-year-old boy with a shaving cut on his jaw who took 4 paces towards the worst thing in London that morning, because there was somebody standing in front of it who hadn't heard the birds go. I think about the drain. 40 minutes he watched it. He must have known, in whatever way you know a thing like that, that if it came, it would come from there. He watched it anyway. We're all standing on something, I suppose. That's what I've landed on after all this time, and it isn't clever and I'm not a clever man. Most of us go our whole lives without ever finding out what's under the road. He found out at 19. And the last thing he did, before it opened up, was put himself between it and a stranger.